The 3rd of April, 1943. A lone Wellington bomber crosses the Dutch coast at barely 200 feet. Navigation lights extinguished, engines throttled back to whisper quiet. In the bomb aimer's position, Flight Lieutenant David Shannon watches the dark landscape slide beneath him, counting the seconds until the drop zone. The aircraft carries no conventional bombs tonight. Instead, nestled in specially modified bomb bays, 36 small cylindrical canisters wait in silence. Each weighs just 4 pounds. Each contains enough incendiary material to turn a Messerschmitt into a puddle of molten aluminum. At precisely 2:17, Shannon releases the first stick. The canisters tumble into the darkness, their descent barely audible against the wind. They're falling towards Schiphol Aerodrome, where dozens of German aircraft sit in neat rows waiting for dawn. The crews are asleep. The sentries patrol their usual routes. Nobody looks up. Nobody hears the soft impacts as 36 small objects scatter across the grass between the hard standings. 7 minutes later, the first canister ignites, then another, then 6 more in rapid succession. Within 12 minutes, Schiphol is ablaze. The fires spread from aircraft to aircraft with terrifying speed, jumping from wing to fuselage, from engine cowling to fuel tank. By the time the German fire crews arrived, 11 aircraft are already beyond saving. The attack has lasted less than 20 minutes, from the moment Shannon crossed the coast to the moment the last canister burns out. Not a single shot has been fired. Not one bomb has exploded. Yet Schiphol's operational capacity has been reduced by nearly a quarter. This is the story of one of the Second World War's most ingenious and least remembered weapons, the 4-pound incendiary bomb with self-igniting mechanism. Colloquially known as the SD-4, or scatters, it represented a fundamental shift in thinking about how to destroy an enemy air force, and its impact would ripple through aerial warfare doctrine for decades to come. The problem facing the Royal Air Force in 1942 was deceptively simple to state, impossibly difficult to solve. German aircraft were destroying Allied shipping at an alarming rate. U-boats found their targets because Focke-Wulf FW-200s and Junkers Ju-88s guided them there. Convoys burned because Heinkel HE-111s torpedoed them. The Luftwaffe's bomber and reconnaissance aircraft operated from a network of airfields scattered across occupied Europe, from Norway to France, from the Netherlands to Denmark. These aircraft needed to be destroyed, but conventional bombing had proven woefully inadequate to the task. The mathematics were brutal. A standard 500-pound high-explosive bomb might crater a runway or destroy a hangar, but aircraft themselves were remarkably difficult to hit from 15,000 feet. Even when a raid succeeded in damaging an aerodrome, repair crews could render it operational again within hours. A cratered runway could be patched, a damaged hangar could be bypassed. But aircraft represented years of manufacturing effort, skilled labor, and irreplaceable materials. Each FW-200 that burned meant one less submarine found its target. Each Ju-88 destroyed on the ground meant dozens of merchant seamen who might see another sunrise. Between January and September 1942, RAF Bomber Command flew 184 sorties specifically targeting airfields in occupied territories. They dropped 441 tons of high-explosive ordnance. The confirmed destruction tally was pathetic. 16 aircraft destroyed, 23 damaged. The resource expenditure was staggering. 11 bombers lost, 78 aircrew killed or captured. The equation simply didn't balance. For every German aircraft destroyed on the ground, the RAF was losing nearly an entire bomber crew. The existing approach wasn't just inefficient, it was unsustainable. The challenge seemed insurmountable. Aircraft on the ground were small, mobile targets scattered across large areas. They could be dispersed, camouflaged, or moved into reinforced hangars. Even a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb might destroy only 1 or 2 aircraft, and direct hits from altitude were rare. What Bonner Command needed wasn't a bigger bomb or a more accurate bomb sight. They needed a fundamentally different approach to the problem, something that could turn the very nature of an aerodrome from an asset into a vulnerability. The solution emerged from an unlikely source: the Chemical Defense Research Department at Porton-Down, working in conjunction with the Ministry of Aircraft Production's Armament Design Department. The lead designer was a civilian chemist named Dr. Alwyn Rowe, whose pre-war work had focused on industrial applications of thermite compounds. Rowe understood something fundamental about aircraft that most weapons designers overlooked. They were extraordinarily flammable structures wrapped around tanks of highly volatile fuel. An aircraft on the ground represented, in essence, a carefully assembled collection of combustible materials. Aluminum skin covered fabric-covered control surfaces. Magnesium components sat millimeters from rubber seals. Fuel tanks, even when empty, contained vapor far more explosive than liquid petrol. The engines themselves contained residual oil and grease. Everything about an aircraft's construction made it vulnerable to fire. Yet existing incendiary weapons were designed for structures, not vehicles. Rowe's innovation was to create a weapon that combined the spreading characteristics of a cluster munition with the sustained burning temperature of a thermite incendiary. The SD-4 measured just 12 inches in length and 3 inches in diameter. Its outer casing was fabricated from thin magnesium alloy, deliberately chosen because magnesium itself burns with fierce intensity once ignited. Inside this casing, a thermite mixture combined aluminum powder with iron oxide in carefully calibrated proportions. The burning temperature would reach approximately 2,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to burn through aluminum aircraft skin in seconds. The self-igniting mechanism was equally ingenious. Rather than using a conventional fuse that might be detected or disabled, Rowe employed a chemical delay mechanism. A glass ampule containing concentrated sulfuric acid was suspended within the thermite mixture. When the bomb struck the ground, the impact shattered the ampule. The acid then began eating through a thin celluloid disc that separated it from a mixture of potassium chlorate and sugar. The dissolution of this disc took between 7 and 30 minutes, depending on temperature and atmospheric conditions. Once the acid reached the chlorate mixture, ignition was instantaneous and unstoppable. This delay mechanism served multiple purposes. It allowed the attacking aircraft to be well clear of the target before the fires began, reducing the risk of anti-aircraft fire directed at illuminated bombers. It created confusion among defending forces, who might spend precious minutes searching for unexploded ordnance rather than fighting fires. Most importantly, it meant that bombs scattered across an aerodrome would ignite at irregular intervals, creating multiple fires that overwhelmed firefighting capacity. Manufacturing took place at several facilities across Britain, though the primary production site was located at RAF Wellington in Lancashire. The work was classified, naturally, and workers were told only that they were assembling special markers for Pathfinder aircraft. Production numbers remain partially classified even today, but estimates suggest approximately 800,000 SD-4 canisters were manufactured between late 1942 and the war's end. Each bomb cost roughly 8 shillings to produce, compared to over 30 pounds for a standard 500-pound high-explosive bomb. The economic efficiency was remarkable. For the cost of one conventional bomb that might crater empty tarmac, you could produce 75 weapons specifically designed to destroy aircraft. The canisters were packaged in special containers called SBCs, small bomb containers, each holding 90 SD-4s. These containers were designed to split open at a predetermined altitude, typically between 200 and 500 feet, scattering their contents across an elliptical pattern roughly 150 yards long and 50 yards wide. A single Wellington bomber carrying 4 SBCs could carpet an area of approximately 600 yards by 50 yards with 360 individual incendiaries. If German aircraft were dispersed at standard intervals across that area, even a poorly aimed drop could put multiple aircraft within range of the burning canisters. The operational deployment of the SD-4 began in earnest during the spring of 1943. Following successful trials at the RAF bombing range at Orford Ness, the aircraft selected for these missions were primarily Vickers Wellingtons and de Hemiond Mosquitoes, both capable of the low-level approaches necessary for accurate delivery. The raid on Schiphol was merely the first of dozens conducted across occupied Europe throughout 1943 and 1944. Records from No. 2 Group RAF document attacks on Leeuwarden, destroying at least 9 FW-200s in a single night. At Aalborg in Denmark, a 4-aircraft raid scattered over 1,400 SD-4s across the aerodrome, resulting in confirmed destruction of 14 aircraft, with another 20 damaged.
The German response was telling. Within weeks, aircraft dispersal patterns at major aerodromes changed dramatically, with machines spaced much further apart and protective earth revetments constructed around parking areas. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe ground crews was substantial. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which announced themselves with the crescendo of falling bombs and gave personnel time to seek shelter, SD-4 attacks were insidious. A crew member might walk between aircraft completely unaware that dozens of incendiaries lay scattered across the grass, waiting to ignite. After several attacks, German personnel became increasingly reluctant to conduct night maintenance or remain near parked aircraft after dark. This operational disruption, though difficult to quantify precisely, represented a secondary benefit beyond the simple destruction of hardware. The German response to the SD-4 was characterized by confusion and inadequate countermeasures. Initial reports from attacked aerodromes described bomb fragments that subsequently caught fire, suggesting that German intelligence initially misidentified the weapons as faulty high-explosive ordnance. Once the true nature of the SD-4 was understood, attempts were made to develop detection and clearing procedures. Personnel were instructed to search airfield surfaces before dawn each day, using long poles to probe the grass and identify unexploded canisters. This proved both dangerous, as the shock-sensitive canisters sometimes detonated when disturbed, and largely futile, as the small size and coloration of the bombs made them nearly impossible to spot in poor light. Germany's own attempts to develop equivalent weapons came remarkably late and proved technically inferior. The Sprengbombe DW4 brand bombe developed in late 1943 used a similar thermite filling, but employed a conventional impact fuse rather than the SD-4's delayed action chemical ignition. This meant German incendiaries ignited immediately upon landing, allowing defenders to identify and extinguish fires before they spread. The delayed ignition of the British weapon was the crucial innovation that Germany never successfully replicated. American forces, by contrast, studied the SD-4 with great interest and developed their own variant, designated the M69 Incendiary cluster bomb. The American version was larger at 6 pounds and employed a slightly different thermite composition, optimized for wooden structures rather than metal aircraft. These weapons would see extensive use during the firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities in 1944 and 1945, though the Americans never achieved the same level of effectiveness against airfield targets that the RAF managed with the original SD-4 design. The actual historical impact of the SD-4 is difficult to assess with absolute precision, largely because many records from both RAF and Luftwaffe sources remain classified or were destroyed during the war's final months. Conservative estimates based on post-war British intelligence assessments suggest that SD-4 attacks accounted for the destruction of approximately 400 to 600 German aircraft on the ground between 1943 and 1945. Damage to perhaps twice that number rendered aircraft temporarily unserviceable, removing them from operations during critical periods. These numbers should be understood in context. The Luftwaffe produced approximately 89,000 aircraft during the Second World War. 500 aircraft destroyed represents roughly half of 1% of total production. In purely material terms, the impact was modest. However, the strategic calculus becomes more favorable when considering resource expenditure. The RAF lost approximately 35 aircraft conducting SD-4 raids, compared to the hundreds lost in conventional bombing attacks on airfields that achieved far lower destruction rates. The psychological impact on German operations was almost certainly greater than raw numbers suggest. Though quantifying fear and operational disruption remains an inexact science, the SD-4's influence on post-war weapons development was substantial and enduring. The concept of cluster munitions designed to attack area targets with multiple submunitions became central to Cold War aerial warfare doctrine. American CBU series weapons, Soviet PTAB anti-tank bomblets, and modern submunition systems all trace their conceptual lineage directly to innovations pioneered in the SD-4's development. The delayed action principle found applications in anti-personnel mines and modern area denial weapons, though these descendants have proven far more controversial than their progenitor. Today, surviving ST-4 canisters are remarkably rare. The Imperial War Museum in London holds 3 examples in its collection, rendered inert through removal of the thermite filling. The RAF Museum at Hendon displays a sectioned example showing the internal mechanism. Occasional discoveries of live ST-4s continue to occur at former aerodrome sites across the Netherlands and Denmark, usually during construction work. These discoveries invariably result in evacuations and controlled detonations by bomb disposal teams, as the chemical delay mechanisms remain functional even after 8 decades, and the thermite filling has not degraded appreciably. The scattered canisters that fell on Schiphol that April night in 1943 represented more than simply an innovative weapon. They embodied a fundamental shift in military thinking about how to neutralize an enemy air force. For centuries, the prevailing doctrine held that you destroyed enemy aircraft by shooting them down in combat or bombing them in their factories. The ST-4 demonstrated a third path: you burned them where they slept. Dr. Alan Rowe's small magnesium cylinder filled with aluminum powder and iron oxide achieved something that thousands of tons of high-explosive ordnance could not. It turned every German aerodrome in occupied Europe from a secure rear area into a potential inferno. It forced the Luftwaffe to expend resources on dispersal, protection, and detection, rather than operations. It killed aircraft quietly, methodically, and economically. Each canister that ignited represented not just the destruction of metal and canvas, but the elimination of the countless sorties that aircraft would never fly, the bombs it would never drop, the submarines it would never guide to their targets. The genius of the ST-4 lay in its elegant simplicity. It required no sophisticated guidance system, no cutting-edge metallurgy, no breakthrough in explosives chemistry. It simply recognized that an aircraft on the ground was a collection of flammable materials arranged in the most vulnerable possible configuration, and it exploited that fundamental weakness with ruthless efficiency. 4 pounds of thermite, a glass ampule of acid, and a celluloid disc were all that stood between an FW-200 Condor and oblivion. The forgotten canisters scattered across dozens of aerodromes throughout occupied Europe did precisely what they were designed to do. They burned. And in burning, they changed how nations thought about destroying aircraft, influencing aerial warfare doctrine for generations to come. Sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't the largest or the most complex. Sometimes they're just 12 inches of magnesium casing, tumbling silently through the darkness, waiting 7 minutes to ignite.